Hello, I am going to be talking about administration of research ethics committees, and this is an extremely important aspect of actually creating and running an ethics committee. The regulations need to be very clearly in place, and so what I am going to be doing for the next 15 minutes is talk about what are the standard operating procedures that govern the administration of ethics committees, and also for you describe the documentation requirements that every ethics committee should have. And in this process, I will also describe the way one actually develops and adapts standard operating procedures for ethics committees. So, you must have been hearing this word standard operating procedures or shortly called SOPs very frequently. So, what are these standard operating procedures? When we say standard operating procedures, not only with regard to ethics committees, but also with regard to many other tasks which we need to perform on a routine basis, but with strict effectiveness and efficiency, one usually operates on the basis of an SOP. Standard operating procedures actually define the process by which any specific task is going to be accomplished. So, with regard to ethics committees, the SOPs should define the procedures that will be adopted by the ethics committee to receive, that is receive submissions from researchers, to review, that is review these submissions, decide, meaning making decisions about what is to be the what the ethics committee has to say about that particular submission, and then document, meaning write down what is the decision, and in that process subsequent to writing down also inform researchers as to what they have decided about the submissions that were made to them. The SOP should outline all of this in clear, unambiguous language. So, why do we need SOPs? We need SOPs because very often the ethics committee members and also the secretariat that runs the ethics committee need to know what they should do when they receive a certain document or a submission from what is in certain institutions called PI, and sometimes we also use the word researcher. So, what should you do about it? That is from the side of the ethics committee. Now, what happens on the other side? People who come and give documents for review to ethics committee. Now, those researchers also need to know what all they have to assemble, collate, put together, write and make that submission. So, that standard operating procedures of an ethics committee has to also talk about all of these things. That is another role of the SOP. This is ethics committee members, the secretariat has a certain requirement, researchers have a certain way of drafting their submissions. Now, if these two have to match, only then can an ethics committee sit down and read what is submitted, make sense of it and then give comments or review comments to the researchers. So, there has to be a uniform code that matches the submission requirements and the review requirements, and that is what the SOP represents. In addition to all of this, in the Indian context, the Central Drug Standards Control Organization, which is a part of the regulatory requirement in the country, also tells you what is needed for running an ethics committee, and the standard operating procedures of any institution for ethics committees are also partly dictated by the CDSCO's requirements. So, how do we know how to draft this standard operating procedures? The guidance, as I said, from the CDSCO comes basically because in the process of registration and re-registration, the Central Standard Drugs Control Organization has specified that every ethics committee that is registering should mention certain things. If it has to mention certain things about how it is going to work, it has to have in place the exact procedure with which it will operate, and that is the SOP. Without an SOP, this form cannot be filled. That is what I meant when I said the CDSCO requirements also dictate how an SOP will be, what will go, what is the likely contents of an SOP for an ethics committee. And those issues, there are quite a few issues. It is about a 2-page document which represents a checklist, which can also be used for drafting standard operating procedures, or should be used while drafting standard operating procedures for ethics committees. What are the sources for drafting this standard operating procedures? Now, we can't really suddenly think through and sit down one fine day and draft standard operating procedures for ethics committees, unless of course we have been doing this for a long time, as have been some people. But to facilitate this process, the Federation of Ethics Research Committees in India, Forum for Ethics Review Committees in India, has come up with standard operating procedures that meets almost any contingency. And these go on and on. There are about 21 standard operating procedures which represent different functional aspects of ethics committees. So, this is not something that you can copy straight away and use, but you have to customize to suit the needs of any institution. What are the key considerations for drafting standard operating procedures? Now, when I said customize, you need to think, right, what is the meaning of this customization and how does one customize? It depends on the nature of the research that is undertaken in an institution. Also, the kind of investment which shapes how many members there are in an ethics committee, that means the burden of review, how many people will share, the kind of restrictions that will be imposed and the kind of burdens that will be imposed on members, that depends on the structure. So, when you draft an SOP, you have to keep that in mind, and also the kind of scrutiny requirements that are put in place through the standard operating procedures have to take into account what is the kind of manpower and skill level that is available in the ethics committee secretariat, and whether often, as I showed you in the previous slide, you saw that there were standard operating procedures 21 in number, which represent different aspects of the functioning of an ethics committee. Now, do we have one for each sub action which an ethics committee undergoes, or does one draft one master standard operating procedure which covers everything? You need to take that into consideration. And certain ethics committees need additional standard operating procedures. For instance, how to deal with vulnerable subjects can be one. Certain other ethics committees may have particularly different kind of protocols that come before them, such as medical devices. So, there may be some additional requirements that has to look at the interface between device and human other than what is in the existing guidance. So, all of that should form part of the additional SOPs that need to be drafted. So, how does one go about drafting an SOP? Now, I told you that we already have the checklist that is given by the CDSCO. In addition, we have draft standard operating procedures that meet many contingencies on the FERC website. There can be other ethics committees which are already functioning. So, one can refer to existing standard operating procedures and CDSCO requirements. In addition, by looking at the workload, ethics committee members would also decide what is needed, because they would look at their ability to function, and that varies. It can depend on also the financing mechanisms, the frequency with which committees meet, and also the skill level that is available for both scrutiny and review. And the ethics committee can then adopt an SOP that is acceptable in terms of whether it is going to be an all encompassing one, or whether it is going to be multiple standard operating procedures that take care of different circumstances. And also the SOP needs to take into account what are the circumstances. See, SOPs get usually revised when there is a new legal framework that has emerged, or there is some new regulatory change, or some new guidance, or some international document that has emerged which needs to be addressed through the standard operating procedures. So, then you need to again revise the standard operating procedures. An inclusive standard operating procedure may contain all the things that the ethics committee is going to do, but the disadvantage of such an SOP is it is unwieldy and can be pretty huge in terms of number of pages. Here is one which goes on to almost 23 to 24 pages. Or there can be, as the FERC has, multiple standard operating procedures. In all, at the present moment as we speak, sometime in 2017, there were 21 standard operating procedures on the FERC website which addresses various issues. It also depends, the standard operating procedures should mention the kind of reviews that will be undertaken by the ethics committee. Now, this is generally very well known, but bears repeating. The type of review is a full review which includes a minimum of the quorum, that is the minimum number of members of the ethics committee and the kind of skills that should be available to undertake any review. Now, these are reviews which have to be undertaken, which need these plurality of skills and voices to be heard, and therefore will benefit from such reviews. There are other studies which go under the rubric of minimal risk studies, on which there will be using the, you need to draft clear guidance on what are the kind of studies which will go through this expedited process, which do not need such serious review as a full committee. Then there are other studies which do not directly include any human subjects by way of utilizing predetermined data sets, or not meeting with any human subjects in any form, but using observations in certain places, such studies which are eligible for exemption from review, and even on this the SOPs need to draft clear guidance on what is exempted in unambiguous language, so that the secretariat of the ethics committee is never in doubt as to which category a particular submission belongs. In addition to all these reviews, in any country situation or state situation, there can be studies, an emergency which has arisen out of an existing study which is ongoing, or an emergency that has happened in the community or anywhere else which requires research and requires research to be done immediately, whether or not the ethics committee is scheduled to meet. And such studies also need to be reviewed by ethics committees, and that goes under the rubric of interim or emergency review. So, when there is an emergency for functional or administrative reasons, interim or emergency reviews can be resorted to. The other important thing that the standard operating procedure needs to list are what are the decision making options that are available to any ethics committee. Now, this can be possible decisions that it can take, that is straight approval, and I should honestly tell you, approval with a very minor comment. This does happen for very low risk studies, but is not a routine happening in most ethics committees. Conditional approval is a more frequently occurring event where the researcher is required to adhere or address certain issues of a minor nature in order to receive approval. So, the ethics committee then approves the proposal with those conditions which can be scrutinized and approval given by the member secretary. Then there is contingent approval, which is a category where the researcher has to make a submission whereby they accept certain conditions that needs to be scrutinized again by the secretariat with the member secretary at its head, and then such proposals receive contingent approval again by the ethics committee. The other one which takes more workload for the researchers is when the ethics committee returns for resubmission because it needs additional information. Now, this is an avoidable circumstance if an PI applies their mind to the submission. If all the material that is required for review for approval is actually available, this is something which can be avoided, but oftentimes this also happens basically because of the mismatch in possibly the thinking between the way the researcher looks at a protocol in terms of its technical requirements and the ethics committee looks at a protocol in terms of the human interface of that protocol. So, sometimes ethics committees can require proposals to be returned because additional information is needed. The last decision that an ethics committee makes is denial of approval, and this very rarely happens, but it does happen either because this particular study cannot be done in an ethical manner given the kind of information that has been provided, or because whatever is being planned cannot accord sufficient protection to the participants in the form that it is submitted. Under those circumstances, a protocol can be denied approval. Does the ethics review finish with this? No. Actually, what you need to do is whatever is the decision of the ethics committee, it has to be documented. Documenting actually means writing down the process of review, and when we do that, we need to ensure at least a minimum of 2 reviewers have looked at each of the submission and have come up with decision that is clear and unambiguous and come up with decision. This is not to say other members do not comment, their comments are also folded into the decision making process, and while documenting the decision, it is very important. It is not enough to say what to do, but it is also important to say why the ethics committee is asking for particular changes to be implemented. Then while writing down the minutes, both the rationale for the decision and the corrective measures that have to be implemented by the submitting researcher have got to be folded into cohesive action points for the principal investigator or researcher to undertake. In addition, a review process, how does one do that in an ethics committee? There are certain requirements that have to be adhered to. For an ethics committee to function on the day of the meeting, there should be a clear agenda which sets the sequence so as that all the members know what is going to be taken up, when and how the discussion is going to go. In a review process, it is important to document the presence of a quorum in keeping with the regulatory requirements. There is a need for clear leadership to conduct this meeting smoothly, allowing for multiple voices to be heard. There has to be an allocation of responsibility and an allocation with regard to the items that have to be discussed, that allocates time for decision and decision making and thinking as well. And last but not the least, documentation time should also be thought of while planning, and how it is going to be done and what are the kinds of formats in which it will be done should be part of the standard operating procedures, and the process of approval of the minutes should also be written down in the standard operating procedures in terms of who should sign the minutes and when, and what should be the procedure to be adopted to obtain signatures for the minutes. All of these things are extremely important because only after the signing of the minutes do the minutes have applicability over researchers. And so, one should think of all of these, starting with the agenda, ensuring the functioning with a quorum, conducting the meeting smoothly, keeping time for discussion, documenting the decisions and ensuring its approval. All of this constitute a procedural requirement for any ethics committee. With this, I have addressed the nature of administrative requirements for conduct of an ethics committee meeting. There are many other things which are required for functioning of ethics committees, which will be addressed in various other sessions as well. Thank you.